Andy, please start.
Awesome. I'm good at talking, Lev. And my name's Andy Leonard, for those of you who don't know me. And most people don't know me, so don't feel bad. I'm friends with Lev, and we work together on a project for the same. It was a client for me. It still is a client for me. Lev is doing something different now. And so I cherish any opportunity I have to speak to him because he's a friend. And just a little bit about me. I'm going to be talking today about introduction to Azure Data Factory. I'm co-owner of a channel called the Data Channel, and it's TV for data people. I am disappointed that Frank, the other owner of this, and I have not done more with it yet. We're still trying to learn how to manage all this, but we grabbed that cool name for it. And if you go poking around for apps like on Amazon or, gosh, I forget the others, but you know, it's part of Amazon Fire. It's on the App Store and in the iPhone, iTunes store, whatever they call it. I'm an Android person, so I don't remember. It's in the Play Store for Android. You can go look this up and install it. It's called the Data Channel. And it's free, but if you want to subscribe to it, you can. And I don't even know what we're charging now for it. That's how disappointed I am and how far we've gotten. 11 and I were talking earlier about how I'm a serial entrepreneur. This is one of the 8 things I'm doing right now. I also write, and the latest book that's been published is Building Custom Tasks for SQL Server Integration Services. And I call myself the data philosopher of the DILM, or Data Integration Lifecycle Management Suite. And the business that currently funds all of my other entrepreneurial activities and writing and playing is Enterprise Data and Analytics. I do consulting there. That's how I met Lev, through a client there. And we also sell recorded training. So on Azure Data Factory, on Azure, on SQL Server Integration Services. And there's still a surprising number of people using SSIS. And of course, I'm a husband, dad, and grandpa. I have 5 children, 5 grandchildren. That second bullet there, engineer, is a warning. And of course, I mentioned already, I'm a writer, and I'm less of a farmer than I used to be. We got rid of our chickens a few years ago. But I live in Farmville, Virginia, and I really enjoy
Andy,
living.
sorry.
Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
You showed the book. How many books you published total?
I think it's 14.
14.
It's around there, 12 or 14, somewhere around there. Yeah. So I've been writing the first book that came out. We were talking about that first book earlier, offline, and it came out in early 2006, and it was wildly successful. So for a technical book, I want to say it sold like 40 or 50,000 copies, and I wrote a couple of chapters in it, and there were like 10 authors, and we got paid based on that. But even then, I made more off that book than like all the others combined. So I got really, I had a real anchoring in marketing experience on that. I thought this is going to be awesome, but no, the rest of them have been fun, but I haven't made as much money off of them. And that book was on SSIS. It came out in 2006, right after SSIS was released. SSIS was wildly popular there, and for years. And there's still an awful lot of it out there running enterprises. And people are still buying that book. So that's mostly what I've written about is SSIS. I've started writing more about ADF as I've learned more about it. And while I love being an entrepreneur and the freedom that comes with that, I write because I like to write. And it really messes people up when I tell them that, because they're in this for the business parts of it. And I'm like, no, I find it very cathartic. And to me, it's just like a way for my brain to breathe. I don't know a better way to say it. I make money off of it, and that's okay, but not why I do it. And it's kind of good because I don't make a lot of money. If you do the math, it's way below minimum wage, even with that wildly successful book. So anyhow, this is our agenda for today, and I want to thank Lev for prompting me. I sent him the slides, and he went, "Oh no, you have to talk more about the history and let people know what Azure Data Factory is and ETL tools." Not only did he tell me I do, this is one of the reasons I like working with Lev. Not only did he do that, but today, when I hadn't sent him an update, he sent me what he wanted in it. And so you'll see as we go through this, we're going to do this part first. This is the talky part. And then these three are, the next three bullets here are really demos that we're going to do. So this is a slide from Lev, and he created it. It's a great slide, ETL tools and vendors. And this isn't even all of them. And I don't know about half of these. Lev knew these, and I can't think of anything that isn't on this list. But you can see there's a lot of tools out here for this. And I will share that back when data science became the new shiny, which was probably about 8 years ago, probably maybe even 10. There was a lot of talk about data science, but when they said that word, they really meant at least 2 jobs, probably 3. And the biggest piece of data science was data engineering, and that's what data integration covers. It. You can almost interchange those words, almost, but not completely. And there was a book called Unicorns Among Us, and I want to say it came out in 2014. I can't remember the author's name, but it's short, around 100 pages, and you can get it on Audible, and it's only about 2 hours long, but it's a decent overview of data science, even the way we talk about it today. But the reason he used the term unicorns is because at that time, in order to be a good data scientist, you need to do what we now consider a data scientist. Plus, you needed to be a data engineer. Now, I know from working with Lev, he's both of those, and he was a unicorn back before unicorns were cool. But I am not a data scientist. I can do some statistics, and I'm weak on visuals and graphs and stuff like that. But for some reason, I was doing ETL back when the years began with a 1. I mean, it just was my knack. I was drawn to it, collecting this data from all over the place. And I was writing my own tools because I couldn't find any. And I'll confess, back then I wrote in Visual Basic. I started writing BASIC when I was 12 years old back in 1975. And if you do the math, I'll be 60 this year. And I saw this need. I was doing manufacturing automation integration back in those days. I had a business. That was one of my first businesses that actually paid the bills for a while, for more than a year. And we had programmable logic controllers running machines in the factory and producing all of these data points. Then we had human machine interface, which was in most factories I worked in, they were PCs. And they were running software that would show you a graphic that would represent processes in the machine and things like temperatures and water pressures and that sort of stuff. And those, of course, are data points. And we could use the HMI's ability, the human machine interface ability, to collect these data points and store them in a database. And so back in the mid-90s, I was working with a product, and I did a stress test on it. Remember that engineer thing? That's what makes me annoying. And I turned it on a holiday weekend. I said, collect over 1,000 data points, all of the data points I had, collect all of them every second, which is as fast as it would let me do it. And I turned it on over a holiday weekend, and I left. Now, at that time, I had just learned how to work with databases, and I knew about Access, and that was all I needed. And we can argue about whether Access is a database or not. But when I came back, there was a 4 gigabyte Access file. And it turns out that at that time, that was big data, so big that Access wouldn't open that file. So I realized I had to do something different. I went to, what was it? altavista.digital.com. I opened up Netscape. went to altavista.digital.com and searched for Microsoft database, and I saw this thing called SQL Server. And I grabbed a copy of that, went back, installed that on the same server, and that worked. We collected the same amount of data, 4 gigs of data, but I could query it. So that was back in 6.5. Started working with 7.0 soon after that in SQL Server. And then they developed all of these other tools like integration services. And now there's this whole list that Lev has collected here for us of all of these other tools and vendors that have stuff out there. But I guess what I'm trying to say to you is the idea of collecting data from across a plant floor, or that's what I was working with then, has now kind of matured into collecting data across the planet and actually beyond. One of the things Frank and I do at the Data Channel is we have a podcast called Data Driven. You can reach that at datadriven.tv. We're in our 6th year, and we interview people from all over. And one of our more interesting guests was someone who has built a cloud collector of data for satellite telemetry, rocket launch telemetry, and satellite maintenance telemetry, and all of that. It's a really interesting show. And they realize there's some things you need every time you launch a rocket, of course, or a satellite, but then there's some data you need to collect just routinely to check the health of the instruments and the satellite itself. Pretty fascinating stuff. But it turns out just like data, it's just like collecting data, from your Fitbit or something. It's ones and zeros at the end of the day. So these have all grown and matured into this piece called data engineering. And again, they've kind of now separated data science out to the analytics and the statistical manipulation of the data, predictive, descriptive, prescriptive, ways of viewing the data, or what are you going to do with the data? All of that falls under the category of data science. And I love data science. I'm not as good at that though as I am at this piece. And it's just a thing. I don't know. It's how my brain is wired. I'm glad Lev's around because he can do both. But and this is another great slide from Lev on just how to do good ETL, or extract, transform, and load. Also note that there is another kind of flavor of this and I think it's more popular now, I could be wrong, where you do extract, load, and then transform. And the way this works in a relational database like SQL Server is you may have a tool. One of the tools on the previous slide could do it. They can all talk to SQL Server, or SSIS, SQL Server Integration Services, can certainly do this, and Azure Data Factory. And if you're doing extract, transform, and load, what you're doing is you're reading the data from whatever sources that are out there. You're bringing that data into some server or serverless service that is going to do the transformation. And you can kind of think of it as in flight. Once the transformation is done, it's then going to hand it to some store. Maybe it's a data warehouse, or maybe it's just writing it to a file. It could be any number of destinations. When you do this as extract, load, and transform, and I see this a lot more, especially in cloud services, people will be reading from the same places, and they'll be skipping that transform step and just landing the data somewhere. Maybe it's a Parquet file, maybe it's a pool, some pool solution. And then they will execute transformations on it. And they can do this from a number of things. Jupyter Notebooks can do the transformation, stored procedures. There's all sorts of ways to transform this data. But what they found is the ETL/ELT engines are really biased towards performing, at least some of them, performing like a data pumping action. And so they're good at going out, getting the data, bringing it back, and landing it somewhere. And then they're not as good, some of them, not all of them, some of them are not as good at making that transformation place. I know when I do ELT in SQL Server, whether it's on premises or in the cloud somewhere, I find that I get a lot more performance out of doing the transformation after I've landed that data. And that's just, you can just kind of file that away and think that's what Andy thinks. So don't take that as, it's not going to work that way all the time. There's this whole 80-20 rule that applies. But I've been doing, let's see, I've been doing coming up on 47 years or 48 years of just kind of playing with computers, whether it started as a hobby, and then I've been professional for 25, 28. Yeah, actually it's been 29 years now. So not all of that experience was great experience. Some of that was like, mixed into that was about 20 years of trying to figure out what to do. So there's that. Always be learning, right? Great tools here. I love Lev's diagrams. I am not as good at art as he is, but good ETL architecture with one central layer. He's pulling in things from these A, B, and C sources. That's the E part, extracting. The transformation is happening somewhere in here. And the diagram here indicates he's staging things as files. You can do that. You can stage in any kind of storage that you'd like, but I often do this very pattern that Lev's demonstrating here. Then there's the ETL layer, and then you dump it back after it's been transformed. You load it into some target, and then there's distributions that is also part of the load. Many of these work in phases or steps. One architecture that I use all over the place is not something that I came up with, but I heard about it. I learned about it from a project manager when I was working at Unisys. And that project manager called it an ETL gateway. And I kind of seized on that. And I thought about it more like gates in a lock. So if you think about a large canal, maybe the Panama Canal, I think maybe is the largest, closest one to me here on the East Coast of the US. And I think there's like 20 some feet difference between the sea level in the Atlantic and the Pacific. And then they've got to go up to a lake, and they use that lake, and then they kind of go down. What they do is they will, close the door behind a ship coming in from the east, say going to the west. They'll close the door, and then they'll pump the water up to the level of the next lock, and then they'll open the other gate, and the ship will sail through that, and then they'll close that back door behind it again. And there's another one, maybe they raise it another 20 or 50 feet or whatever. They do that going up, then they do that going down, and that's how a ship traverses the canal. And I love that for gateways. And so I'll do exactly what Lev's drawn here. I will read from the sources, and I'll just stage it. Usually I use a staging database for this, but you can do it in files. The idea is, especially on this extract part, is to get in there, get your data, and get out as clean as possible. You want to do no harm, right? A little bit of medical philosophy here, but first, do no harm. You don't want to stop this, because usually these systems are running the business, and you don't want to interrupt that cash flow, because if you're a consultant, that's how you're getting paid, is by the money they make right here. And if you work for the company, same goes. Your money comes from here as well. So you want to be as the least amount of disruption in here as possible. And you want to stage it somewhere, and then that you can beat on all you want. That's your copy. So you've kind of gone over here, pulled it in. Now you've got your copy, and you can play around with this however you'd like. And I like doing that for staging. And then at the very end, once I've done kind of playing with it and munging and shaping and strong typing and all of that, then I like to write that data out to either a data warehouse or a data warehouse and data marts. And that's what I kind of see out here in BCD, what Lev is showing you here. Love this diagram, Lev. The messy way of doing things are down here. I've actually written some of these, learning how to write these. The ones down here at the bottom. And you can create a lot of nodes, and this is like a very worst case scenario. When I looked at this, I was like, Lev, what did you see my early work? But a lot of good information on this slide, and I'm going to upload this after I'm done with, it's kind of a combination of what I wrote. These two slides I've shown you most recently, I stole them directly from Lev's mini presentation that he sent me. Kind of a brief history of data engineering, and I give Lev partial credit for this. I edited some of what he said. And I told him I was going to bring this up. In the beginning was the idea of SneakerNet. You would take a floppy disk. If you know what that's what the picture on the icon in the save icon button in your applications. That picture is a 1.25. Oh, sorry, 3.25 inch floppy disk, 1.4 megabytes of data they would hold. You copy the data onto that, take it out, go over to another computer, load it into the reader there, a floppy reader, and then you copy commands that way. Back then, I started doing it with DOS. It was a long time ago when the years began with a 1, and we used to carve our own chips out of wood. But that's a bit of a joke. Data transformation services, I didn't mention in here, but Lev did. Actually, I take that back. I copied this one from Lev, and you can see that at the very bottom. This was Microsoft's introduction into data engineering. It wasn't, I mean, you could write T-SQL and store procedures and the like to do this kind of work before DTS came along. But there's a rumor / myth that an intern wrote the original version of DTS while on summer break interning at Microsoft 1 year back in the 90s. And it just took off. There were a lot of people using it because it gave you a nice graphical, well, maybe not a nice one, but it gave you a graphical interface that you could work with. And as powerful as SSIS and ADF are today, there were things that DTS did better. True story. I worked for a guy named Brian Knight, who went on to start Pragmatic Works. I worked with him before he started Pragmatic Works, and he had written a book. He got me into writing that first book on SSIS. He was one of the 3 authors of this big like Bible of DTS that was written back in the 90s. And I learned it from him. And if you're going to learn a tool like that, it's great if you can learn it from somebody who's written a big, thick book on it. He's also scary smart, still is. And it was an interesting tool. And then when SSIS came along, I was working for him. I'd written an article in, I think, Visual Basic magazine, maybe before it was called Visual Studio magazine, trying to get into writing again just because I liked it. And one of his authors quit on the SSIS book, and he asked me, would I be willing to do it? And I was like, yes. So that's how I got started writing, professionally at least. SSIS was it was introduced with SQL Server 2005. That was released in November of 2005. I heard for years that, it was hard to find good information online about SSIS, and it was. But, when I heard that, I had gone through the experience of writing the book. So me and one other author team, us, there was 10 of us. And I don't know how many were on the other team, but we were writing books using the alpha version of this. And we were in communications with the team at Microsoft building SSIS. Great opportunity, really cool, learned a ton about it, but you couldn't find anything on the internet about it because it wasn't out yet. So it was, when I heard people later complain, it's hard to find information. I was like, yeah, you should have been there back in my day. Get off my lawn. But they were right. And I started blogging about it back then in 2006. And I became a Microsoft MVP in, I think it was 2007. Anyway, that's how I got started writing books. Lev asked how many books I'd written earlier, and I don't keep up with it. I'm not writing. I'm writing to feel better about it. Azure Data Factory came out, version 1. Lev did some great homework. I did not remember this. Went into public preview on the 28th of October, 2014, and went to GA on the 6th of August, 2015. It wasn't long after that. I want to say it was in either 2016 or 2017 when the V2 came out, and it was almost a complete rewrite. I mean, I think the copy activity was probably the thing that was used the most in V1, and it made it into V2. But ADF V2 is current, and When I talk to companies, and I get to present all over, I presented in November in Seattle at the PASS Summit, and it's an honor to do a presentation there. I'm always always honored to present. It's an honor to present to you. But they picked about 300 speakers for that, and I got to be one of those. But they only picked 14 or so, 16 maybe, to do full day pre-conference sessions, and I got to do one of those. So, and it's not my first. I've done a handful of those now, and my next one is going to be at SQL Bits this year in Wales. So, and that's coming up in March, mid-March. So I'm very honored to get to do these kinds of things. And whenever I present, one of the things I'll ask people is how many folks are using Azure Data Factory in production. And when I asked that question in November, it was the largest percentage I'd ever seen. And it was almost 40%. Now, if you listen to Microsoft marketing talk about this, you're going to think 90% of the people are using ADF in production, and you are way, 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 way behind if you're still using anything else. God forbid something on premises. But that's just not accurate. And kudos to Microsoft marketing. They've done a great job getting that message out. You need to be in Azure or you're falling behind. And I totally get it. If somebody was paying me $25 billion a year, I'd want to talk up what I was doing as well. So that's not happening yet, and it may not. But I totally get that, but that's less than half still. And I know from talking with people who know that there are literally tens of billions of SSIS package executions happening on premises every year around the globe, more than 110 billion, more than a single 10 billion, tens of billions. So it's still wildly popular, SSIS is out there. Not taking anything away from ADF. And it continues to grow and they keep adding stuff to it, but it's not as big as the footprint being used by SSIS still today. And it's one of the reasons why Microsoft added in September of 2017 into Azure Data Factory version 2, the ability to run SSIS packages from an SSIS catalog in the cloud. SSIS DB or SSIS catalog, whatever you want to say it. They put it into preview then, and about a year and a half later, it went GA, general availability. And just last February, not quite a year ago, they added that ability to do what they call an Azure SSIS integration runtime. That went into preview in Synapse. And there is yet another service that Microsoft is working on. I don't know if they're going to release it or not. They haven't put it into public preview yet, but it is in private preview. And that too will have the ability to execute SSIS. So where I disagree with Lev just a little, and I think it's just because I keep up with SSIS. I still do a lot of work with it. It's still paying quite a few bills. And Lev's doing all of the super complex magic stuff over in Synapse and all of that. Where I differ is that there's still the majority of Microsoft data integration is still being done with SSIS. That's now new development, no. But you look at the entire sphere, still mostly SSIS. It'll probably change at some point. It'll flip, but it ain't there yet. Maybe this year, maybe next. But and the reason Microsoft is allowing companies to move their on-premises SSIS into Azure Data Factory is because they want you to move to the cloud. And that's where they're putting their investment. That's their new shiny. That's what's paying their bills. Totally get that. And in order to make that easy, they realize there's all of this legacy stuff hanging out here, the old SSIS, and they want to encourage you and enable you to, with the least amount of friction possible, take what you've got on premises, move it to the cloud. And that's not where they want you to stop. They just don't want you to pick up your SSIS and run out there. They want you to then examine SSIS packages that maybe aren't performing as well as they could, or maybe that the load, the job itself is not, SSIS is not the best solution for that. Maybe Databricks is a much better solution for that. And you can refactor or rewrite those SSIS packages that are clunking along and taking 3 hours to execute, you can rewrite those as Databricks jobs that take 3 minutes to execute. And there's a tremendous opportunity out there for that kind of work. And that's mainly where I'm working these days. I'm not doing that for the company Lev and I, where I'm doing something totally different. But I'm doing some database refactoring for performance, SQL Server database performance. But the rest of my work is just about 75-25, taking SSIS from on-premises, moving it into the cloud, configuring it so it works well with Azure Data Factory, training people on how to use either SSIS or Azure Data Factory. Mostly these days, my training is Azure Data Factory, so that once you get your SSIS up there, now you want to know how to, how to build other jobs, how to refactor your old SSIS into your new shiny ADF work. So I think Lev and I agree in principle. ADF is the new shiny, and really Synapse is even newer and shinier. One thing about Synapse integration, ingestion integration, the engine beneath that, Synapse, it's calling the exact same webhooks, web apps as Azure Data Factory. It's the same. And that's why if you work with both, you'll see a lot of familiarity. Not identical in the UI, because the UI in Synapse has more features and some features that just don't exist anywhere else. But Azure Data Factory is what's running there under the hood for a solid 90% of what you see even in Synapse Analytics. There's no, as far as I know, there's no overlap between things like Databricks and the other services in SSIS, in the SSIS corner. But in Azure Data Factory, gosh, yes, it's a great orchestration tool for doing that. So maybe I talked too much about that, and if I did, I apologize. And hopefully as we do some demos here, where we provision an Azure Data Factory, and then we'll take kind of a brief tour, and we'll build a pipeline, a very basic pipeline to work here. And then after this, we'll take a look at I'll call it production, but it's smallish. It's only a couple 100,000 rows that I'm moving, but I built it years ago. And you need something simple, I think, to play with, because I believe the best tools were once toys. So let's take a look at a demo here. Let's do some stuff. I got GitHub here because I'm going to come back to that. Actually, I'm going to start here. I'm going to make a new repository in my GitHub repo. I could do this in dev.azure.com. Can't remember the proper name of that. DevOps, Azure DevOps. There it came to me. But I'm just going to call this one Lev and January 06. And that's going to be the name of my new repo. I'm going to make it public. So if you want to come in here and grab this stuff, you should be able to download it if you'd like. I'm going to add a README. This is not a tutorial on creating GitHub repositories by any stretch. But one of the nice things about this is I'm going to pop to home, and I'm going to make a brand new data factory.
Andy, we still see the slide. We don't see what you're doing.
You don't? What in the world? That's crazy talk. All right, let me see what's going on here. It says I am screen sharing.
Maybe you're sharing just one window.
All right, let's try that. See if that does better. Can you see this now?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that. That was me, not operating Zoom properly. Thank you, Lev, for interrupting. So what I did was I just created a very quick repo over here. I named it Lev Jan 06, and it's got right now it just has the one commit, which is the README, and that's all it says is the name. I kind of like the GitHub gives me nice defaults. Defaults are powerful. Here's my data factories. I click the create button. And if I zoom in here, I'm going to make a brand new resource group named, not that, Lev January 06. Copy that again. There, okay. That's going to be my new resource group, and I'm going to name the factory ADF. I'm going to put it in East US. Actually, the East US is about 80 miles that way in Mecklenburg County here. I'm in Central Virginia. They changed this. They changed this default. Defaults are powerful. This was set up to where you would have to fill out all of this information. And if you did, this box was unchecked by default. And you'd have to fill this out, or you'd get an error if you went from basics to review and create. And I'm glad they did that. I didn't mind the other way because it's very important to do source control. Because there's an old saying about using source control developers. There's two types of developers, those who use source control and those who will, because you'll lose code and it'll break your heart. But if you had that unchecked and you went over here, it would give you a big ugly, the validation failed, and it would point you back to this. So let's go and review and create that. We'll create the data factory. It doesn't take very long at all. As we see over here, it's doing the deployment, and it'll take maybe a minute. If no, it even took less than that. And if I go to the resource here, I can see on the summary blade that it's in this RG for resource group Lev Jan 06. And if I launch the studio, it'll take me into adf.azure.com, and the rest of the string kind of directs me to my ADF Lev January 6. So if I expand this navigation blade here, we'll see there's 5 things here. This has grown over time. Home has always been here, author's always been here, monitor has always been here, but these manage and learning center is the very latest thing. There's a lot of good information there, videos and the like, where you can go check out how to do this kind of stuff. What we're going to do right here at the very beginning is we're going to go to manage, and this is, I've started doing this in all my presentations because it's just so stinking important. That's why I created the Git repo to start with. And you go to Git configuration and then configure, and this blade slides out here. It says, hey, which flavor do you want to configure? Because you can do Azure DevOps or GitHub. Notice you're limited to Git. In Azure DevOps, you can still do the old Team Foundation Services way of doing things. And that's helpful if you've got that on premises and you'd like to migrate that to the cloud. Both are free. And I think Azure DevOps will allow you 5 people on your team for free. So if you're doing a small project and you don't want to worry about losing code, you can do Azure DevOps. I don't know what the limit is on GitHub. I've never really done more than like 2 or 3 of us on one. We're going to be using GitHub, and it's asking for the repository owner. And as I said before, you know the month now and the year I was born, and I'll be 60 this year. So it wanted to connect with my repo name. That's what that little flicker was. And I'd already connected because that's how we were able to create the repo in the first place. And it's asking me now, all right, which one do you want to do? And I want to hook into Lev Jan 06. And it's asking me about a collaboration branch. Now, again, this is not a GitHub tutorial, but if I just accept some of the defaults here, this isn't, the default is blank, but I'm going to pick main, and I'm going to use ADF publish. That's a default. And the root folder, I'm going to go ahead and make that just the root folder, that slash. And then I want to import existing resources into this branch. This is interesting because if you've already got a data factory and you're wanting to set up, you want to set it up to work with source control with Git, then you could have 100 pipelines out there, and you can pick import them into main here. Now, for all my talk about SSIS integration with Azure Data Factory, one of the things to keep in mind is it does not bring in your SSIS packages. So if you create an SSIS integration runtime, which we're not going to do, and you put a bunch of packages out there, and you think, all right, now I'm going to configure my repo, and it's going to save everything, packages and all, it will not. There's ways to manage that, but they're beyond what we're going to talk about. And one of the ways to manage it, I actually wrote in Excel. So now it's applying this, and it's going to ask me once that repo is finished, what is your working branch? And I'm going to work with main. Again, there's debate on this. It's almost becomes a religious war among serious developers that do other types of development, not just, ADF in a silo. So if you're working with ADF, it may not be as complicated as all that. However, if you want to join a repo where there are developers doing, I don't know, Node and JavaScript and whatever, and you want your branch to be part of that, that's not a bad idea if you've got a big enterprise thing going on, to kind of maintain a branch with all that. But even then, I don't know enough to make that statement with any kind of gravitas. So just be aware of that. But there is some neat integration between both Azure DevOps and Git and Azure Data Factory. And I'll show you just a little bit of that. So it's telling me, I've got my repo configured. Notice that this changed. Prior to this, when I was running in live mode, and notice I can switch right back to that. I really had these two spaces when I was in live mode before I did the Git integration. And now after the Git integration, now I've configured a repo, I've got 3 places. So let me kind of walk you through what they look like. So right now, if we were to go back to the author page, we don't have any pipelines or data sets or anything like that configured. And if we go back to GitHub and refresh this, you see right now it says 1 commit. I'm going to hit the F5 button here. It should be 3. And what it's done is it's kind of put the a couple of things in here in addition to the README. One is the publish config JSON, and then the factory itself. This is a folder in here, and it's got just some JSON in here for the factory. What's kind of cool is it's all, everything is stored. All of the configuration is stored right here in JSON. Lev mentioned earlier and in his blurb that he sent me that SSIS was XML, ADF is JSON. And I have a friend, Kevin Hazard, and his one of his things he likes to say is JSON is hipster XML. Yeah, he's funny too. But yeah, here's all of the stuff now in there. So if something bad were to happen and I were to lose my code, I should have a copy of it in here, depending on how I've managed this integration. And I'm going to pop over here a few more times before we're done. But here's the author page where we can author all of these things. Notice templates, one of the options, Power Query, data flows. Mark Cromer just released a book a few months ago, last summer, on developing, they used to be called mapping data flows. But if I pop over here to Amazon real quick, and Amazon.com, I'm so used to relying on shortcuts. And I search for Mark Cromer data flows. Mark runs the team at Microsoft. He owns this at Microsoft, the mapping data flows. And this is a good book. I learned a lot about mapping data flows. I did the technical edit on this book, and I learned a ton from it. And Mark's a great author, so kudos to him for doing that. That's what data flows are, data sets, and then pipelines. So you can think about a pipeline as the orchestration. In fact, I will create a new pipeline, and this is how you do it. You can hit those ellipses here, or you can actually hit this plus up here, and then you get the menu. If you pick on pipeline, notice data set doesn't have a sub menu, data flow does, and Power Query and copy data tool. We're not going to get into all of that, but I'm just kind of doing a survey of where things are. And when I click on pipeline, this is an orchestration, and I like to think of ADF like an onion. And I didn't warn you about this prior, so I apologize, but there will be movie quotes. And that's kind of a paraphrase of the movie Shrek. Ogres are like an onion. ADF is like an onion. And here in the, at about midway through, if we peel the layers back, a couple layers back, we get to a pipeline. This is an orchestration engine. if you're familiar with SSIS, this is like a control flow where you have, here you have outputs that perform the operation that an SSIS control flow precedent constraint. So it kind of sets up, run this thing, and when that thing finishes, then run this next thing. That's what outputs do. Precedence constraints do that in SSIS. Outputs do it here in ADF. Outputs are more powerful. That's not the only thing they do here, while precedence constraints, that's all they do in SSIS. So here we've got this. There's the name for it. It's pipeline 1. We'll leave it as such. And before we configured Git, everything that we did in here was subject to us losing it. And in fact, we can mimic that if I just close this, and it'll say discard changes, and it would do that in the past. And if we click close and discard changes here, even now we would lose our empty pipeline. So I'm going to click cancel. The only way to save this prior to running in Git was to publish it. We had these two places. This is the design surface, kind of our development area, and it's volatile. So we have to put it somewhere else in order to save it. Prior to configuring Git, the only other place we could put it was to deploy it into the Azure Data Factory proper. If we did that, and that's deployment is publishing. If we did that, then that version of it would be saved out there. Well, we got this middle version here. And because of I'm using Git, I can click Save All, and it'll save this pipeline. Not only that, but I want to show you what happens if I try and publish this pipeline. I'm going to zoom out so you can see the blade slide out, tell me what's wrong. And it tells me there's a publishing error. And if I slide over here and look at the error, pretty good error message. The pipeline 1 should have at least one activity. It won't let me publish an empty pipeline, but it'll let me save it if I'm using Git. That's an important distinction, I think. And I love that piece of it. So if I put a, if I were to put, I'm going to stick an activity on here, and then I'm going to kind of return to talking about all of the layers of the onion. This is a wait activity, and I'm just going to go with the defaults. The activity settings will tell me how many seconds to wait. It defaults to 1. There's a spinner here. And although I'm not going to go into it beyond this, if I click in this value, I get this add dynamic content option. And what this allows me to do is use Azure Data Factory expression language to place a value into this property, the wait time in seconds, from some other place. It could be a variable, it could be a parameter, it could be the result of a query. There's a number of ways to do this, and it gets way crazy when we start talking about parameterization and externalization in here. And this is an introduction. So I'm going to leave this hard-coded to 1. And if I click off this, notice that I go back to these other tabs. Now, there's a properties tab over here that you can get to by clicking that. And that's where you find things like the pipeline name and the description and stuff like that. And if you click that button again, it's a toggle. It hides it again. That properties used to be out here, and to be honest, I kind of liked it out here. But this is where I would store any parameters. Parameters of values for the pipeline. They're pipeline scoped. These parameters are. And these are values that you set prior to executing the pipeline that remain static. They remain read-only throughout the execution. So what if you want to iterate across something, and you want a value to kind of keep track of, or you want some mechanism to keep track of the value of that? Well, you use a variable for that, because they can change. Variables can be updated as packages run. I keep saying packages. Sorry about that. Pipelines. I'm an old SSIS guy. And I won't talk about settings and output and all of that, but that's the basics of what you need here. And that's just for the pipeline itself. But notice when I click on the activity, I get an activity specific menu here that has things like the name, the description, and it's indicated these little red asterisks here, maybe a little hard to see, but those indicate that is a required property. Notice description is not. Settings is a required property, but it gives you a valid default. And if you put an invalid number in there like 0, it'll fuss at you. Well, I said it would fuss at me. It's still telling me I need to configure one of the settings. You see that little one, because 0 is not a valid value, and negative values aren't valid either, unless you have a DeLorean, another movie reference. I know, bad joke, but I'm trying to keep you awake. So this is at the heart of what we're going to be doing in Azure Data Factory. Is we're going to be using activities, and here's our activities list. And I won't go through these, but you can figure out some of what they do just by looking at them. If you've done SSIS in the past, you're familiar with a data flow, a transformation called lookup. This is not the same thing. In fact, if you're familiar with SSIS, this lookup is way more like an execute SQL task that stores values. It brings back a results in, either a scalar or a collection of values. That's more what the lookup does. But note, you can execute pipelines. You can execute SSIS packages. So there's a lot of stuff you can do in here. A couple of the newer ones, script is probably my favorite new thing they added here. It has a lot of functionality that it can do. Again, not going to go into that too much. Calling the store procedure is exactly what it says. And my other favorite new one is fail. So this is for fault tolerance. I can generate a message, an error message, dynamically using that dynamic language I talked about when we looked at the wait time in seconds. And that way I can kind of construct user-friendly fail messages based on conditions that exist, and maybe variables or parameters that are set in here. Love that. That's under general. Move and transform. That's that copy data that I mentioned earlier. That's been around since V1, and it is a real workhorse. Probably the most used activity in Azure Data Factory. Data flows perform similar operations as a copy data, but it's more discrete, and they keep adding transforms and stuff to the data flows. We could do Mark wrote a whole book on it. So we could do a whole day on just that part. Azure Data Explorer. I'm pretty sure this is the command version. This used to be a data exploration, but I may be confusing that with something else. They actually had 2 flavors of data flows there for a while. Mapping data flows is the one we have now, and we just call that data flows. But I can't remember exactly what they called the other one. But it was more like what data exploration is. You're trying to pick around, you're running profiles, you're trying to find what matches what, and it's a whole piece of, once you've got connections to your sources, that's probably the next step that you would do in data engineering / data science. And I often see the data scientists or the analysts doing this piece, by the way, when I work with them. I usually just do the engineering. Being able to run Azure functions is interesting. There's some cool benefits to being able to have this. The batch service gives you the closest thing to like being able to run a custom activity. That last book that I wrote was about building custom SSIS tasks. And I've actually been bugging the team, the ADF team, saying, hey, I want to be able to write a custom activity and drop it into the toolbox like I can do with a custom SSIS task. And so far they've said, yeah, maybe later, we'll see. That's okay. I won't quit until they do it. A lot of Databricks functionality here. A bunch of power in notebooks, jars, and Python. Data Lake Analytics, so you can run USQL commands here. We already looked at general HD Insight, Hive, and the like, and Spark's under here, raw Spark. And by the way, you know this probably, Databricks is Spark on steroids. Some iteration and conditionals, and this list grew quite a bit in the past year. They added, let's see, they had if, and I want to say they had like if and filter before, or if and for each. And they definitely added switch and until. These are kind of cool. Machine learning interactions, so you can run batch You can update, and you can just execute a machine learning pipeline. Pipelines are everywhere. And then of course, Power Query. So lots of stuff. And like I said, as far as pipelines go, the activities are at the very inner piece of this. But you've already seen where you can do things like run a data flow. So that would be even farther in. The rest of the onion, the outside of this from pipelines, there are data sets. That's kind of the next layer out. And some of these operations require data sets. Wait doesn't, but like things like lookup do. And beyond that are link services. And link services, they reach out and talk to the rest of the world. So I'm not going to do anything that uses a link service, but I'm going to click on the link services here on Manager and just show you what it looks like. So I'm going to zoom out and click New. And like if I wanted to create a link service to a blob storage, I would pick that, and it would give me a good solid default name, Azure Blob Storage 1, and it would ask how I want to connect to it. This is kind of my authentication, and I can use account keys, SAS URI, that's shared access, signature, universal resource something. I don't know what the I stands for. If you do, type it in the chat there. Service principals, the SAMI and the UAMIs, system assigned managed identities, and user assigned managed identities. I find myself mostly using one of the managed identities or the SAS URI. The account key, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. I've done service principal, but only when the client asked me to. So, I may pick an SAS URI, and and I can test the connection to a link service, but notice I haven't filled any of the answers to that question out yet. Let me open Storage Explorer, and Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer is available for free at storageexplorer.com. You go there and it takes you to it's a redirect, but it'll take you to another location. You can download it. They update it probably about once every month or so. And it's, like I said, it's free, and we'll see what we can connect to here. We'll get one that's going to make more sense later. So not an Edna one. And I'm going to do the emulator. I'm waiting for these to load. Take that back. I might use the Edna one. Yep, there's a new one available. I am using an Edna one, and this isn't going to make a lot of sense right now, but this is a storage account named STAW. It'll make more sense later. And I've got a file, a CSV file in a container here. And this container holds a file that's updated once an hour. So it did about 12 minutes after the hour, and it's AccuWeather.csv. If I want to get to that file, I can right click and I can get a shared access signature. Now, I love this. So like right now, it says it's good until a day. It's good for a day, it expires. I am not a DBA. Oh, that's fine, Rachel. See you later. And Lev will put up the recording so you can check and send me an email directly or to Lev, and he can reach me about what I did that you disagreed with. So I'm not a DBA, but I've done the job a few times when they couldn't find a real DBA. And one of the things I would do is somebody would say, hey, I need access to this, this view for the next month. And so I would write write out the create or grant access statement for that person for that view. And then in a comment beneath it, I would write the revoke access. And what I'd do is I'd actually save that script in on my calendar, like for the morning after it was supposed to expire. It would pop up as a message and say, hey, you need to run this script. And I would copy the revoke, paste it into SSMS and run it. You don't have to do that with us. Like I can change this to 12/31/2023, and it just goes away at the end of the year. I don't have to tell it to do anything. Oh, Tyler, great, thanks. And Tyler appreciated the movie reference. He mentioned that in the comment. Thank you, Tyler. And so I want to read this data, and notice I've got a list of permissions here I can do. Probably the read is a good one. If I'm doing the shared access signature for an entire container, one of the other permissions I'll pick is list, so I can list the items in here as well. So read works, and then I can click create, and when I do, it gives me these two pieces of information. One of them is part of it actually has more than I need here for the URL, but I'm going to copy that, pop back over here to our, that's the book. Let me zoom out, pop back over here to our SAS URL, shared access. And notice it gives me a kind of a good sample there, and I'm going to paste over that. And when I do, there's the CSV file that I want. Now, this SAS token, shared access signature token, as far as I know, this goes away when you close that window. So I usually leave this open. I click copy, I put it on the clipboard, pop back over here and paste. And Yuri, take care. Thanks for coming. And if you have any comments, send them on. So once I've done this, I'm not ready to test the connection. If I test the connection right now, it's going to fuss because I haven't, actually, that's not true. It will work, but I haven't clicked close, and I like to do that and then test that connection. So this is what I mean by link services being to the outside world. And my LastPass plugin got excited because it saw a password field. There's connection successful. That means I can click create, and this one will just work. And if I wanted to create a data set to go along with that, it's creating this still now. I could go to the author page, and one of the things I can create here is a new data set. So this blade slides out, and I have to tell it again, which flavor am I after? And they're knocking on the door of about 100 different types of connectors here. Some of them are in preview. If I scroll down, but they've got, I think it's north of 90, and I know they're close to 100. Some of these will be, like I mentioned, will be in preview. Let's see if we can find one. There's one, Marketo. That one's in preview. Here's another one, Oracle Response Sys. It looks like these two Oracles, and the third one, Oracle Service Cloud, PayPal. A lot of connectors in preview, which is awesome. And these are being updated in a few weeks, it seems like. So I'm going to do a blob storage, and I'm going to click continue. Notice it asked me for my file types. And I always like to point out here that for the longest time, Excel wasn't one of them. And people go, Excel. But the truth is, a lot of clients use Excel, and a lot of business critical data is there. So if you're writing a solution, you may need to get to that data. And prior to them adding a way to connect to Excel, you'd have to find some other way to get that data out. Usually converting it to a CSV was popular, and then doing it that way. This is delimited text. It's a CSV file. And if we click continue here, it's, what do you want to name it? I'm just going to leave the default name, delimited text 1. And there's my Azure blob storage 1. The first row is a header. I know this file. And then I can say import the schema from the connection or store. And then when I click OK, it's going to give me a failed because the remote server returned an error. Forbidden possible root causes, grant principal or managed service. So this is a brand new Azure data factory. You saw me make it here. One of the things I want to point out about this is you look at an error like this and think, oh my gosh, don't, please. You're going to hit these errors all the time. And I'm kind of glad this popped up because I've been doing this for years and I always hit errors when I do it. Get familiar with the errors. You're going to see them, and then be able to manage them when they come along. It's telling me grant service principal managed identity appropriate permissions to do the copy. And it's telling me that at least the storage blob data reader role. Not uncommon to run into something like this. So let's pop over here to our storage accounts. Let's go back to home, get storage accounts, and we're on the wrong subscription. That's okay. That's kind of neat, right? You can use different subscriptions. And I'm about to mess up here, so I don't want to do what I just started doing. What I'm going to do is here, I'm going to change subscriptions over to my other one. That's where that storage account lives. Kind of cool that you can do this, right? STAW is that storage account. And I want to go to the access control, and enroll assignments. I want to do my very best to try and grant this access to that data factory. And as I'm thinking through this, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it or not. Let's go look. Here's our storage blob data reader role. I want to use a managed identity. At least I'm going to try and do a managed identity to get over here. Doesn't have my other subscription in this list. I'm no longer optimistic. So I'm going to stop here rather than let this go down the path that it will probably go down. I didn't mean to get us so tangled up in the security parts of it. While I love the security, it's not my strong point. And I'm going to go ahead and cancel this.
Andy, but maybe it's okay because we're already more than an hour, and usually our
Are we?
meetings.
Gosh,
yeah.
I need to talk faster. Okay. Well, I actually did all of the 3 demos that I wanted to. The last one was that build a pipeline one. I'll just walk you through what the data we were looking at is from a place called Andy Weather. And it's an Accurite weather station talking to an extremely old, like 16, 17-year-old e-machine. Got 2 gigs of RAM and it's running Windows 7 32-bit Ultimate. So this is great for engineering because you want to stress things and it's really not hard to stress that machine. It writes that blob, the CSV file, up every hour. And there is a pipeline that's running over on that other subscription that once that blob is written, you can trigger pipeline execution based on a blob creation. That's like magic. So as soon as it's finished uploading that file, triggers the load, and here's a pipeline over here with the load in it. A very kind of withdrawn view of that. And then it loads the data into a table, an Azure SQL database table in the cloud. And one place you can go see the data is at andyweather.com. So if you go there, you'll be able to view it. It gives you an hourly update, the temperature in my office right here where I'm presenting from. And there's an instrument pack about, I don't know, 50 yards that way. And it's collecting data from the instruments outside. And finally, there's another application that tweets about every 12 minutes or so. And there's an Andy Weather Twitter account. And it'll tell you some of the same information. I blogged about all of this in the Andy Weather Internet of Things blog post over at andyleonard.blog. And I put the code in there for the 2 applications. The one that loads the blob from the local machine, the CSV file here from that e-machine up to blob storage. And there's another application that does the tweeting. So, and I tell you how to build the pipeline if you'd like to build all that. That's kind of cool. Like I said, the best tools were once toys, and this is a toy I've been working with for a long, long time. Isabel and Lev, you're the only 2 left. If you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it.
Well, first of all, thank you. It was great. About tweeting, is also implemented in a Data Factory, or it's a different application?
It's different. You have to set up an application at Twitter to do that. There's some steps you have to go through there. I covered in that blog post. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you can automate your tweets, Lev, if you want to. I wrote it in C#.
Oh, okay. So it's something completely different.
But it's like a dozen lines of code. It's really not a lot.
Okay. Bella, do you have questions?
So far, no. It's an amazing presentation. Thank you very much for your, detailed explanation. Actually, thanks a lot.
You are very welcome, ma'am. It warms my heart. This is why I do it. So, people help me.
We can feel your passion, definitely.
Well,
Which
thank
is
you so much.
which is pleasant. It's not often we can meet people in the IT industry who has a passion.
Lev
Okay.
knows everybody.
No.
He's the man.
Yeah, he is. Yes, of course.
Okay,
Lev is special.
I'm stopping the recording. Hold on a second.
Okay.
Okay.
Stopping.